I was 34, and for a long time, I truly believed I had reached the peak of my career. I was the lead structural engineer at a design firm in Phoenix, responsible for projects most people thought should only be handled by teams twice my size and twice my age. But everything changed in one single afternoon the moment I got the call saying the foundation at Southridge had started to sink. When I arrived, the ground looked as if an invisible force had pulled it downward, leaving long cracks crawling across soil that was supposed to stay steady. I stood in the middle of the site feeling like someone had punched me straight in the chest. It took us 3 weeks to investigate, and every trail pointed to one thing. The contractor had swapped out materials, using cheap sand, cutting the cement mix, and even adding water just to increase the concrete volume. I had suspected something was wrong even before the pour, but every warning I raised got buried under the pressure of a project that had already dragged on for months. I thought the inspection reports would protect us. In the end, people only looked at one line: Chief Engineer, and that was my name. During the emergency meeting, the executives did not care about the evidence I put in front of them. They wanted one person to blame. The company collapsed under the weight of that broken trust, and I became the name mentioned in every article analyzing the failure. Overnight, I went from lead engineer to the person labeled careless, the one supposedly responsible for dozens of people losing their jobs. I thought I could carry that pressure until the night I came home and found my husband packing his things. We had argued before about how much time I spent at the site, but I never imagined he would walk out right when I needed someone beside me the most. He said he was tired of living in a marriage where my work always came first, and he did not want our daughter growing up in that kind of atmosphere. He left that night. Lily was 8. She looked at me with those wide, unsettled eyes every time my phone lit up with calls from former coworkers. I could see the worry settling into her, the kind of weight no child should carry. Whenever I opened my laptop to apply for jobs, she stayed close, as if afraid one more mistake would make everything fall apart again. I tried to reassure her, but the truth was, I did not know if I could stay steady myself. The next few weeks were a blur I still do not like remembering. I sent out dozens of applications. No one responded. In this industry, rumors move faster than load charts. One employer even told me that hiring me would make clients nervous. I swallowed it quietly, not knowing how to explain any of this to Lily. I sold our second car, cut every expense that was not essential, even considered leaving Phoenix altogether and starting somewhere no one knew my name. Then, on a heavy late August afternoon, everything shifted. I got a call from a man who introduced himself as Mason Hale, owner of Hale Builders. His voice was low and steady, carrying the kind of certainty I had not heard from anyone in a long time. He told me he knew all about Southridge and knew it was not my fault. He said he needed an engineer who understood the work from the ground up, someone who could stand on a job site and know exactly what was happening beneath their feet. I did not trust it at first. Months of harsh judgment had made skepticism my first instinct. But Mason continued. Hale Builders was expanding, and he needed someone with real field experience, not a manager who lived only on paper. He invited me to Prescott to meet him. I hesitated, then thought about Lily, the debt stacked up on my desk, and the way my name had been wrapped in failure for far too long. The Hale Builders office was not big. It was modest but solid, more honest than most places I had worked. Mason came out, shook my hand, and looked at me as if he already knew who I was. He did not ask the same questions everyone else had. He did not make me defend myself or relive the disaster. He asked only one thing: did I still believe I was a good engineer? When I stayed quiet, he said every foundation can be reinforced, as long as the person doing the work has not given up. The conversation did not last long, but it was enough for me to feel something I had not felt in months. Someone saw my worth without the shadow of someone else's mistake covering it. On the drive home, I found Lily curled up on the sofa with her old stuffed bear. She looked up when I walked in and quietly asked if we would have to move. I held her close and realized I already knew what I needed to do. That night, I called Mason and accepted the offer. I did not know what the future would look like, but I knew I could not let the past bury me any deeper. I needed to stand up for myself and for my daughter. And the next morning, I started again from zero, in a small company where someone finally believed I was still worth rebuilding a life around. When I started at Hale Builders, I was not given the role of lead engineer the way I once had. Mason wanted me to rebuild from the ground up, and I agreed because I knew I needed to earn trust again in the most humble way possible. My first job there was simply reviewing field logs and checking old construction drawings. I did not see it as being pushed down. I saw it as a test, a way to understand how this company truly operated. In that first week, I realized most of their records were handwritten, unlinked, and inconsistent in the inspection steps. With the dry, scorching climate of Arizona, even one mistake in timing a concrete pour or curing materials could lead to a serious failure. I spent a few weeks improving every small stage. I created a process to check concrete surface temperature before pouring, added guidelines for curing under intense sunlight, and rebuilt the standards for soil inspection. When I submitted everything to Mason, he looked at me for a long moment and simply nodded. He did not say much, but that quiet approval was enough to push me forward. And slowly, the changes showed real results. The sites no longer suffered surface cracking from heat, and schedules stabilized because the crews were not fixing preventable mistakes anymore. Each day, I arrived at the job site early. I stood with the supervisors under the heat that could roast anyone, correcting survey markers and checking every layer of rebar. At first, some of the workers were not used to a woman standing in the middle of the site giving precise instructions. But when they saw projects finishing on time and passing inspections with higher ratings, they began to trust me. I became the person they sought out when something went wrong. I did not need a title to become the technical anchor of the whole team. Lily was about 9 then. On days she did not have school, I took her with me to the job site. She loved watching the cranes swing huge concrete blocks, loved listening to me explain why the sand needed a certain level of moisture, and she loved asking questions that left me both tired and amused. She grew up around the sounds of drilling, clashing steel, and the smell of fresh concrete. I was a mother, an engineer, and the only pillar holding up a home with just the two of us. Some days I felt completely drained, but when I saw her happily coloring shapes that looked like construction frames, I knew I was on the right path. About 2 years after I started, Hale Builders began receiving more and more project offers. The company's reputation spread beyond the main street of Prescott, reaching Cottonwood and Sedona. A developer in Nevada wanted to test a small residential project and invited us to bid. Mason sent me to lead the technical survey team. When I stepped onto that vast stretch of red Nevada dust, I knew we had a chance to leave our first mark outside Arizona. I prepared an exceptionally detailed construction plan, accounting for high winds, expansive soil, and the sharp temperature swings between day and night. The developer was impressed with my thoroughness and awarded the entire project to Hale Builders. It was a turning point. When the project finished without a single error, the inspectors noted that our foundation deviation was lower than the required standard. That recognition spread our name into a few regional conferences, and soon, more clients in Nevada began calling us. Throughout all of this, Mason never treated me like an employee who needed to prove her worth. He gave me a kind of trust I had never seen in my previous career. He handed me full authority over technical decisions and let me manage the supervision teams directly. I knew that without him, I might never have stood back up after Southridge. Whenever I presented a new plan, he asked only one question: "Are you sure?" And when I nodded, he signed without hesitation. From 6 people, Hale Builders grew into a team of more than 40. New employees were told I was the person who would explain everything about the technical side. Some of them joked that the company had 2 pillars: Mason, who kept the finances standing, and me, who kept the quality standing. It surprised me, but it also warmed something inside me in a way I did not expect. I had once been stripped of my reputation by unfair blame. Now I was recognized by the work itself, and I no longer felt the need to prove anything to anyone. One day I was invited to a meeting with a major client. When Mason introduced me, he said Ava is the person who keeps every structure we build standing firm. He said it simply, but it awakened a confidence I thought I had lost forever. Not just clients, but everyone in the company slowly began seeing me as the one they could rely on without question. I rebuilt my name not with explanations or excuses, but with straight foundations, crack-free structures, and technical decisions grounded in safety. Those 11 years were not easy. But step by step, I felt myself rebuilding the life that South Ridge once shattered. I did not know what the next years would bring, but I believed my new foundation was strong enough to hold me up through anything. And I had no idea that those peaceful years were preparing me for a storm I never saw coming. I thought I had seen enough shifts in this industry to no longer be surprised by anything. But what I never saw coming was the return of Ethan Hale. That morning, while I was watching the crew set the formwork for a new project outside Prescott, Mason called me back to the office immediately. When I stepped into the conference room, I saw a young man leaning back in his chair, one leg crossed over the other, turning a polished metal pen in his fingers, like it was more of an accessory than a tool. It was the first time I saw Ethan after years of hearing Mason mention him. Ethan had just returned from New York after finishing his graduate business program. He was 28, carrying the confidence of someone who had never truly shouldered responsibility. His smile was polite, but there was a hint of challenge in it, as if the world were nothing more than his personal playground. Mason introduced me as the chief engineer and the one who had kept the company steady for many years. Ethan shook my hand, but the way his eyes drifted around the office told me he was silently judging everything, already imagining which walls and desks he would replace with something sleeker. That very afternoon, Ethan insisted on joining the meeting for the new project. While I walked through the construction plan, he kept cutting in, suggesting we shorten the concrete pouring time, even though Arizona summers could crack uncured concrete in a matter of hours. When I said we needed 3 weeks for loading tests and safety checks, Ethan immediately objected, claiming it would bore the client and cost more money. I asked what data supported his ideas, and he shrugged, saying the construction models on the East Coast were far more efficient. I looked at Mason, expecting him to step in, but Mason simply smiled and told me to consider Ethan's suggestions. I had worked with young engineers eager to prove themselves, but Ethan was nothing like them. His lack of real field experience was dangerous, yet he carried an unwavering belief that clean numbers on a business model could replace standing under 40-degree Arizona heat while checking microfractures in concrete. What worried me more was the way Mason watched him. His eyes were full of hopes he had never shown anyone else, as if he finally saw the successor he had always wanted. By Ethan's second week back, he began showing up at every site. He would park right at the gate, step out in a white shirt that made no sense for a construction zone, and expensive leather shoes that had never seen dust. He spoke to the workers but never asked about concrete moisture levels or rebar placement. Instead, he talked nonstop about doubling productivity, expanding Hale Builders across the entire Southwest, and turning us into a regional brand. One of the workers whispered to me that Ethan looked more like someone acting out a role than someone doing real work. Ethan's flashy ideas began bleeding into our meetings. He suggested creating a cheaper pricing package to lure clients in, even if it meant cutting essential safety procedures. He proposed promising timelines half as long as the actual requirements, saying clients loved boldness. I tried explaining that construction was not like the tech world. You could not reduce everything with a few keystrokes. Each time I said that, Ethan laughed and asked whether I was afraid of change. The atmosphere in the company began to shift. Some of the younger staff admired Ethan's confidence and his grand promises. They believed he was simply trying to prove himself to Mason. Meanwhile, the older employees were uneasy. Marcus Lee, our most loyal site supervisor, quietly told me Ethan was like a storm, loud and fast, capable of sweeping everything away if no one held the line. I understood that fear, but I tried to stay calm, hoping this was only an initial adjustment period. Still, I could not ignore the growing sense that my position was being threatened. Ethan never said it outright, but every look he gave me in meetings carried a silent judgment. I had spent more than a decade guiding Hale Builders through its most difficult years, and now someone who had never stood on a field in harsh weather was making decisions that could put the entire company at risk. One afternoon, while I was reviewing detailed drawings for a project in Nevada, Mason walked in and said he wanted Ethan to learn more from me. He told me to mentor Ethan the way he once mentored me. I said nothing, but I understood exactly what I was facing. This was not just a reckless young employee. This was the heir Mason had pinned every hope on. No matter how inexperienced Ethan was, no matter how unreasonable his proposals sounded, in Mason's eyes, Ethan remained the future of Hale Builders. For the first time in many years, I felt my own foundation tremble slightly. Not because I doubted my abilities, but because I could see a storm forming on the horizon. And Hale Builders, the place where I rebuilt my entire life, was about to face changes I was not sure I could save it from. I did not have to wait long to see that Ethan would not stop at flashy ideas in the conference room. He began changing the very core of the operating system I had built over 11 years. One morning, just as I stepped into the office, Rebecca from coordination ran to me in a panic, saying the entire project management software had been replaced overnight. I opened my computer, and she was right. The familiar system was gone, replaced by a cheap program with a rough interface, no quality tracking, and no field log storage. I called Ethan into a small meeting room to ask why. He calmly said the old software was too expensive and the company needed to cut monthly costs. I asked if he knew the new system did not track material temperatures during construction in extreme Arizona conditions. Ethan shrugged and said that large firms in New York use cheaper options to optimize expenses. I told him Arizona was not the East Coast. He did not care. He said I was overcomplicating things. Those changes turned out not to be the worst part. A few days later, I discovered Ethan had canceled our long-standing contract with one of the most reputable foundation subcontractors we had ever worked with. He replaced them with a low-cost group that did not even hold a state license. When I demanded to know why, Ethan said their prices were nearly 30% cheaper and would boost our profit margins. I told him licensure was not something you compromise. He fired back that I was stuck in old thinking and did not know how to compete in the modern market. Chaos hit the job sites immediately. The bargain contractors did not know the required pre-pour inspections, and Ethan pressured the younger engineers to skip soil checks to save time. I went to the site in person and ordered the work stopped, but Ethan had already overridden me. He wanted faster progress so he could report to Mason that his approach was superior. I realized this was no longer a difference in technical opinion. Ethan was determined to prove himself, even if it meant ignoring basic safety principles. What hurt more was the shift in Henry Cole. Henry was a veteran engineer, the man who once stood with me under nearly 46-degree heat to check rebar for a major project. He had always supported every safety standard I set. But now he sat in the meeting room, nodding along with Ethan and calling his proposals necessary innovation. Ethan had promised Henry a technical manager position if his changes worked. I saw the hesitation in Henry's eyes, but in the end, he chose Ethan's side. As things spiraled further out of control, I decided to talk to Mason. I laid out everything, from the cheap software and unlicensed contractors to the pressure Ethan was putting on the engineering team. Mason listened, but his expression was no longer the same. He said I was worrying too much and that Ethan needed room to fail so he could learn. I told him mistakes in construction were not just numbers on paper. They could mean cracked slabs, collapsing structures, or accidents we would never be able to undo. But Mason looked at me as if I were resisting the future. He said I was being too rigid and needed to be more open to change. I walked out of that room feeling like I had lost something precious. Not just Mason's trust, but the position I had spent years building. And I began to understand that Ethan was not just a passing storm. He was the person Mason had placed all his hopes on, no matter his actual ability. The internal fractures reached their peak during a meeting with a major client from Las Vegas. I was presenting a safe construction plan for a commercial project when Ethan suddenly stood up and cut me off. He told the entire room that my proposals were slow and outdated. He said I was afraid of challenges, afraid of change, and that Hale Builders needed bolder steps if we wanted to compete in the Southwest. The room went silent. I looked at Mason, waiting for him to step in, but he did nothing. He only glanced at Ethan and gave a small nod, as if agreeing with every word. That moment felt like a deep cut through everything I had built. I knew that he would try to prove I no longer belonged here, but I never imagined Mason would allow it to play out in front of a client. When the meeting ended, the client said they needed to review the timeline again because they sensed the company lacked alignment. That was my worst fear. It was not just safety at risk anymore. It was the reputation I had fought to protect. That night, I drove home in silence. Lily asked if work was all right, and I smiled so she would not worry. But inside, a question kept echoing. Did Mason still see me as a pillar of this company, Or was I just a temporary bridge for Ethan to cross on his way to becoming the successor? That question felt like a hairline crack, spreading deeper each day, and I no longer knew if the foundation I had built for Hale Builders could withstand the next blow. After the meeting with the Las Vegas client, I began noticing the quiet shifts Ethan was setting in motion. He started holding private discussions with Mason, carrying colorful reports and growth charts built from the prettiest assumptions possible. I happened to see a few drafts left on the shared printer. Every number in them was pushed to levels only someone who had never supervised real construction would believe. He projected productivity doubling, timelines cut in half, and profit margins rising by nearly 30%. Those were not operating models, they were fantasies. I was not surprised when Henry Cole continued siding with Ethan. He appeared in every meeting, praising Ethan's vision and saying the company needed fresh ideas. I saw Henry avoid my eyes whenever I asked about the real data. Part of me wanted to believe he was under pressure or tempted by the position Ethan promised him, but eventually I accepted what was clear. Henry had chosen his side. One morning, Mason called every employee into the main conference room. The moment I walked in, I sensed something was different. Ethan stood beside Mason with his hand resting on the back of a chair, as if it already belonged to him. On the large screen were new slides full of bold goals I had never seen presented in any technical meeting. Mason stood and, with excitement in his voice, said Hale Builders was ready for a major leap forward. Then he said the words I had feared for a long time. Ethan would take over as the new chief executive, and I would be moved into administrative support and technical documentation. He said it as if it were a logical arrangement, like shelving an old machine to make space for a newer model. I heard someone inhale sharply behind me, but all I felt was the coldness spreading through my hands. I asked Mason if he actually believed the numbers Ethan was pushing. Ethan did not let him answer. He stepped forward and said I should not make everyone tense. He told the room I was a good engineer, but times had changed, and the company needed a more modern business mindset. I said nothing. I wanted to ask Mason what I had done wrong after 11 years of carrying this company through every storm. But when I saw his eyes fixed on Ethan, I understood every question already had an answer. When the meeting ended, people dispersed with uneasy faces. Some of the younger staff looked at me with sympathy, while the older ones stayed silent. Ethan walked up close, so near I could smell the expensive cologne he wore. He leaned in slightly and murmured just loud enough for me to hear, "You should learn from the new generation." His tone felt like the final cut across my pride. I did not return to my desk. I went straight to Mason's office. I told him I could not do paperwork after spending my life standing on job sites. Mason only sighed and said he needed to balance old experience with new thinking. He told me not to take it personally, then placed a hand on my shoulder, the way someone consoles an employee demoted for poor performance. I listened, but the sincerity was gone. Mason no longer saw me as the foundation of this company. He saw me as the shadow easing the path for his son. I walked back to my desk, opened my computer, and typed my resignation. I refused to let Ethan think I would sit quietly and serve as office decor. When I stepped outside, I handed the letter to Rebecca. She froze for a moment before pulling me into a tight hug. Marcus stood behind her, eyes red. He could not speak, only gripped my shoulder. Their embraces only deepened the ache inside me. I was leaving because I had been betrayed, but I was also abandoning the people who had stood beside me for years. As I reached the parking lot, I saw Lily sitting in Mason's car. He had asked his assistant to pick her up for me since he thought I would be in meetings all day. Lily ran toward me and wrapped her arms around my waist. She looked up at me with worry written all over her face. "Mom, you got fired because of me, right? I do not want you to be sad anymore." I held her close, feeling the weight of the entire day press into that moment. I told her it was not her fault, that adults sometimes make unfair decisions, but we have to remember our own worth. I said it to comfort her, but I was also reminding myself. When I closed the car door and looked back at the building where I had rebuilt my life over more than a decade, I understood Hale Builders was no longer mine. I walked away, not because I was weak, but because I knew I deserved a place where dedication did not become something expected to be replaced. That day, I left Hale Builders with a heavy heart, but my head held high, and I had no way of knowing that only a few weeks later, That decision would become the most important one of my life. I left Hale Builders without any clear plan for what came next. The years I spent there had become a major part of my life, and losing my role was not just painful. It left me standing at a crossroads with no idea which direction was safe anymore. In the days after I left, I drove Lily to school, then came home and sat in front of my computer, opening the same job listings over and over without being able to hit submit. I did not want to return to roles I had long since outgrown, but I was not sure I still had the strength to start from scratch again. A week after I resigned, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. The woman introduced herself as Vivian Torres. I recognized the name instantly. She was one of the major investors in Phoenix, a client who had partnered with Hale Builders on several important projects. I never imagined she would reach out to me at a moment like that. She asked to meet at a quiet cafe near downtown. When I arrived, Vivian was already there. She wore a light gray blazer, her black hair tied neatly back, her eyes sharp, yet calm in the way only someone who has weathered countless deals could be. After a few polite greetings, she looked straight at me and spoke with a blunt honesty I could not avoid. I know what happened at Hale Builders, and I know the only reason that the company survived more than a decade was not Mason, and certainly not Ethan. I stayed silent. Maybe I had been waiting months for someone to say those words, yet hearing them from Vivian made them unexpectedly hard to swallow. She reached into her bag and placed a folder on the table. She told me she was expanding into light industrial construction and needed someone trustworthy to ensure no project would ever sacrifice safety for profit. She wanted me to lead a new company. She would invest. I would manage. Full operational control. No interference. I sighed. I told her I once led the technical side of a company and watched it fall apart because the blame landed on me. I knew what failure felt like, and I did not want to relive it, especially with Lily depending on me. Vivian tilted her head, her eyes softening just a little. She said one mistake could not define my entire career. She said if I let fear make my decisions, I would end up repeating the same cycle. Then she delivered a line that stayed with me. Your daughter deserves to see you rise, not retreat. That sentence hit the exact wound I had been trying to hide. I knew Lily had absorbed too much in the past year, from the collapse at my old job to the divorce to the pressure of watching her mother try to stay strong. I did not want her to grow up believing injustice could break a person forever. I asked Vivian for a few days to think. I barely slept during that time. I was afraid of failing again, afraid of placing my trust in the wrong hands, afraid of watching everything slip away like before. But somewhere inside that fear, a small spark returned. The chance to build a place where I could define every standard, every process, every person on the team. A place where no one could tear me down just to make room for someone else. In the end, I called Vivian and told her I would do it. The signing took place in her attorney's office, not extravagant, but perfectly formal, the way serious business should be. And just like that, Carter Structural Group was born. On the first day, it was only me sitting in a temporary two-room office with an old wooden desk. But when I looked at the brand new nameplate on the door, a rush went through me. The same feeling I used to get standing on a job site at noon, exhausted and wide awake at the same time. I knew my life had shifted into a new chapter. 2 days later, Marcus Lee showed up. He stood outside the office door, still holding his hard hat. When I opened the door, he said nothing at first, just held out his application. I asked if he was sure. He said he had seen enough of what Ethan was doing. He said he wanted to work somewhere buildings were not turned into experiments for reckless ideas. I hired him on the spot. Not long after, Jenna, a young engineer I had mentored in her early years, sent an email asking to join. She wrote that she had left Hale Builders because she refused to stay in a place where safety was treated like an obstacle. When I finished reading her message, my throat tightened. Someone still saw what I had been fighting for. That was how Carter Structural Group began. Small, but filled with fire. Lily was thrilled when I told her I had my own company. She told her teacher, then drew her version of our logo. In the afternoons after school, she sat in the corner of the office coloring while I worked, occasionally asking innocent questions that dissolved all the pressure inside me. Watching her smile, I realized I was walking the right road. The company grew faster than I expected. Vivian referred a few small clients. and after just 2 early projects, positive word spread through the region. Former colleagues from Hale Builders began calling, asking if I was hiring engineers. Everything unfolded naturally, as if all I had to do was build the right place, and the right people would come. Looking back at the chaos I endured at Hale Builders, I finally understood something. Sometimes the collapse of one door is not an ending. It is the force that pushes you toward the one that was always meant for you. Carter Structural Group was not a grand empire, but to me, it was the strongest foundation I had ever built. And this time, no one could break it unless I allowed it. News of my new company reached Hale Builders faster than I expected. I knew the moment I got a short message from a former employee. Ethan is furious. I was not surprised. Ethan had always treated his position at Hale Builders like an inherited crown, and my departure did more than remove a pillar from the company. It created a comparison he never wanted to face. Who had truly kept that place standing for 11 years? His retaliation started with rumors. One morning, Marcus walked into my office looking irritated. He said Ethan was spreading claims that I stole internal data before leaving, that I had taken contractor lists, design files, and client records for my new company. I laughed because the accusation was childish, but Marcus did not laugh. He said a few contractors had already called, worried they might get sued if they continued working with Carter Structural Group. I knew Ethan would try everything to keep them on his side. I was not surprised when, a few days later, a major subcontractor told me Ethan had called them directly, warning that Hale Builders would stop using their services if they collaborated with me. Some firms, dependent on long-term contracts with Hale Builders, had to hesitate. I did not blame them. I simply took note of the reality I would have to push through. I had known this road would not be easy from the moment I signed the formation papers. Ethan did not stop there. He began submitting bids so low that they were nearly impossible. I recognized the tactic instantly. Win jobs by volume to create the illusion of rapid growth. But underbidding in construction is the fastest path to disaster. When real costs exceed the promises, something gets cut, and what gets cut is either quality or safety. Marcus said Ethan was digging his own hole. I knew he was right, but I also knew Ethan would try to drag me into it before it opened beneath him. His next move was far more calculated. Jenna brought a set of construction documents into my office, sent by a subcontractor. A glance told me something was wrong. The footing depths and rebar layers did not match the standard I had given the client. I checked my previous emails. The design I sent was completely different. Someone had swapped it before it reached the subcontractor. I called them right away and asked who sent the new files. They said someone from Hale Builders had emailed an updated version, claiming I asked them to forward it. I knew instantly who had done it. If the subcontractor built from the wrong design and the structure failed, the state inspectors would come after Carter Structural Group first. I sat down and breathed deeply. Ethan did not just want to compete, he wanted to destroy me. But I had survived one collapse. I would not let another one take me down. I reported everything to the State Construction Inspection Office, sending both versions of the design for verification. At the same time, I ordered the subcontractor to pause all work until the documents were cleared. By reporting it myself, I protected the company from Ethan's trap and showed the subcontractor exactly how transparent we were. When the inspectors confirmed the design had been tampered with and the sender was not me, they ordered Hale Builders, not Carter, to explain. I took no joy in seeing Ethan cornered, but I felt a rare relief. This time, no one would pin the blame on me. A few weeks later, Carter Structural Group received a call from a major investor in Flagstaff. They wanted us to bid on a new logistics center. I assumed it was just a polite invitation, but at the first meeting, I learned they had been watching my work for years. They said they wanted a team that put safety first, not flashy timelines or shortcuts for quick profit. I poured everything I had into the design and construction plan. Marcus handled the site assessment, and Jenna double-checked every number. When we presented to the board, they listened to every word, nothing like the skeptical meetings I used to endure at Hale Builders. 2 weeks later, they announced that Carter Structural Group had won the bid. I did not say it out loud, but when I opened the email, I felt like I had reclaimed a piece of dignity stolen from me years before. I pictured Lily's smile when I told her that her mother's company would soon build its first major structure. Meanwhile, things at Hale Builders only worsened. A project in Tucson developed concrete cracks 4 days after pouring. Scaffolding at the Prescott site sank, injuring a worker. The technical team whispered that Ethan was making reckless decisions, and Henry could no longer control the inexperienced crews. Hearing it weighed heavily on me. I did not want Hale Builders to collapse, but I also knew I could not go back and save them. I had chosen my path, and now I had to walk it. Standing on the empty lot in Flagstaff where Carter Structural Group would build its first major project, I felt a peace I had not felt in years. Not because I had defeated Ethan, but because I was building something with my own hands, without anyone overshadowing my worth. And this was only the beginning of the quiet war between me, the heir of Hale Builders. But this time, I was not afraid. I had stood back up once after being knocked down. I could do it as many times as I needed. I never wished for Hale Builders to collapse, even after the way they hurt me left a deep cut. But when I heard that the scaffolding at the Prescott site had partially fallen, injuring a worker, I knew the consequences of Ethan's reckless decisions had finally reached their limit. That small accident was enough for the State Safety Division to launch a formal investigation. When inspectors arrived, they discovered the scaffolding crew had no valid certification, exactly as I had warned. The media moved quickly. A local paper led a series of investigative reports showing Hale Builders had repeatedly hired underqualified, low-cost subcontractors. A few former workers even spoke publicly, saying safety procedures had been shortened for months. The news spread fast, and their major client in Tucson announced a temporary shutdown of the entire project. I watched everything unfold in silence. Hale Builders had once been the place where I rebuilt my life, but now I only felt sorry for the innocent people still holding on. Still, I knew this was the result of warnings ignored again and again. Good employees began to leave. Rebecca texted to say she could not stay in the chaos any longer. I immediately brought her into Carter Structural Group. Marcus said he was getting calls from former engineers who no longer trusted Ethan. I accepted only those who truly wanted to build something new, not those simply running from the old. They understood and respected that boundary. The person who weighed on me the most was Henry Cole. He had supported me for years, before choosing Ethan's promises of a higher position. Now, Ethan was placing the entire Prescott incident on Henry, accusing him of poor supervision. Jenna said Henry looked hollow, barely speaking to anyone. I wanted to call him, but I knew he was facing the painful truth in his own way. One afternoon, while I was reviewing technical files for the Flagstaff project, my phone rang. Ethan. I almost did not recognize his voice. No arrogance, no swagger, only panic. He said the company was about to lose its third contract in a month, that clients were demanding full audits, and reporters were outside the office asking for statements. Then he said something that made me go silent. Ava, let's work together. Help me save the Hale name. I understood the desperation behind his words, but I also understood I no longer owed anything to a place that chose to cast me aside. I told him I could not save a company built on wrong decisions. Ethan tried to say more, but I wished him luck and ended the call. I thought that would be the end of it, but a few days later, Mason appeared at my office. He walked in like a man who had lost the most important thing in his life. His hair showed more gray, his eyes more hollow. He sat across from me, but it took him a moment to speak. He said he was wrong. He admitted he trusted Ethan blindly, ignored my warnings, and let the company slip to the edge. When he asked me to return and help save Hale Builders, I felt a sadness I had no words for. I had once respected him. I had once believed there was an unbreakable trust between us. But he did not stand with me when I needed him. He let Ethan tear me down in front of the entire company, and he stayed silent. I told Mason I had tried to save Hale Builders many times in the past, but every chance to course correct had been thrown away by him and his son. Mason lowered his head. In that moment, I saw a man realizing the legacy he had built over 3 decades had been destroyed by his own heir. I felt no satisfaction in seeing that, but I also knew I could not go back. A week later, the official news broke. Hale Builders had filed for bankruptcy. Media outlets covered every angle. Employees scattered. Job sites shut down. Clients moved their contracts elsewhere. Some reporters asked if I wanted to give a statement. I simply said no comment. I stood by the office window reading the final article about Hale Builders. The Arizona afternoon light stretched across the empty land where Carter's structural group was about to build its largest project yet. I knew then that an old chapter had closed, quietly, without fanfare or vindication. It ended the way a foundation ends when the cracks run too deep to save. I was not happy. I was not sad. I simply felt calm. Because for the first time, I understood something clearly. Not everything you lose is a loss. Some things are simply no longer yours to carry. 6 months had passed since Hale Builders filed for bankruptcy, and Carter's Structural Group looked nothing like the tiny company with 2 rented rooms it had been on its first day. Our project list grew so quickly that I opened a second office in North Phoenix and hired more engineers just to keep up with the workload. We were not the biggest firm, but we had become one of the most respected when it came to transparency and safety. Clients who had known my work from years before now came to us on their own, saying they wanted to build with a team they could trust completely. Vivian Torres stopped by from time to time, asking about progress, but she mostly stood back watching the engineers work with a quiet smile. She once told me I did not need to prove anything to anyone, only to keep doing exactly what I had done since day one. Maybe she saw something in me that I had not believed in back then, that I could stand on my own without hiding behind any company or name. Lily had grown so much in those 6 months. She loved telling her classmates that her mother had her own company. Every afternoon when I picked her up, she ran out holding a new drawing of the buildings she wanted me to construct someday. Some days, she said she wanted to be an engineer like me. Some days, she said she only wanted to be the person who made sure I did not overwork myself. I did not know what her future would be, but if she felt proud of her mother, that was enough for me. Our little family slowly settled into a peace I once thought I would never have again. I no longer woke up in the middle of the night, fearing someone might destroy my career. I no longer needed permission to enforce higher safety standards. I no longer felt watched or measured for someone else's ambition. For the first time in many years, I lived a life where I did not have to brace myself just to prove my worth. One morning, I received an email from the Arizona Construction Association. They invited me to be the keynote speaker at their conference on ethics and safety in the industry. When I read the invitation, I set my hand on the desk and exhaled slowly. 2 years earlier, if someone told me I would stand on a stage speaking about professional ethics, I would have laughed. But now the invitation felt like confirmation that the path I had taken was right. On the day of the conference, I arrived early. The hall was wide, softly lit, and filled with hundreds of engineers, contractors, and investors waiting. When I stepped onto the stage, I recognized dozens of familiar faces from across the industry. I spoke about transparency, about refusing to trade safety for speed, about the lessons I learned from mistakes that were not mine, but forced me to rise and change direction. When I finished, the entire room stood and applauded. I did not feel celebrated. I simply felt like I had finally spoken the words I once needed to hear on the day everything fell apart. Walking off the stage, I saw a still figure near the back of the hall, Mason Hale. He wore an old suit, his frame thinner, his posture heavier. He did not approach. He only stood there, looking at me, with the expression of someone finally facing a truth he had avoided too long. His eyes were sad, but no longer defensive. I knew he was not there for forgiveness. He was there to acknowledge that everything I said on that stage was what Hale Builders had lost long ago. I bowed my head to him slightly. He returned a barely noticeable nod. No apology, no tears, no attempt to reclaim what was shattered. Just two people understand that some things break in ways that cannot be rebuilt. I no longer held anger toward him, but I no longer belonged to the part of my life that had included him. That afternoon, I visited our new project on the outskirts of Phoenix. We were building a small research center for a university, a project I loved because it felt like creating a future for someone. When I stepped onto the seventh floor terrace, the wind was strong and the Arizona sky burned with its deep summer orange. I stood there, looking at the steel lines rising clean and true, hearing the workers laughing below, feeling the steady vibration of the concrete slab beneath my feet. In that moment, I understood something with absolute clarity. To reach this point, I had lost many things: trust, stability, and a career I once believed would carry me through my entire life. But without losing those things, I never would have dared to rebuild the foundation of my own life. The strongest foundation is not a company, not a reputation, not the validation of others. It is I. And the small family waiting for me every evening, I stood there until the last bit of sunlight slipped behind the Camelback Mountains, feeling as light as if I had finally set down a weight I had carried for more than a decade. I had lost everything. But because I lost everything, I built a new foundation, stronger, steadier, and completely mine. And this time, no one would ever be able to break it again,